My sister tapped a fork against her champagne glass at my own wedding reception, waited for 200 guests to go quiet, and told everyone she had an announcement of her own to make. 6 months later, she married my fiancé in the same reception hall, on the same parquet floor, under the same string lights I'd paid a deposit for and never used. 11 months after that, karma didn't knock politely. It arrived with a subpoena, a frozen bank account, and a hotel manager in the Maldives asking them to please step into his office, and it did all of that 3 days before their honeymoon was supposed to end. I'm the reason it found them. Not because I planned it. Because I'm good at my job, and my job is finding the truth in numbers that other people have gone to great lengths to hide. Welcome back to Calm Stories Time, where ordinary people face impossible moments and come out the other side with their dignity intact and, sometimes, with the truth doing the talking for them. If you've ever loved someone who chose your sister over you, if you've ever sat in a room and smiled while your whole life came apart in front of an audience, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because you are going to want to see exactly how far this went. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 31 years old, and for the last 6 years I've worked as a certified fraud examiner, first at a Big Four accounting firm and now at a mid-sized risk and compliance consultancy that regional banks and mid-sized companies hire when something in their books doesn't add up. I find money that isn't supposed to be missing. I trace wire transfers through shell companies. I read financial statements the way most people read a text message, and I can usually tell within the first 10 minutes of an interview whether the person across the table is telling me the truth or a very carefully rehearsed version of it. I tell you this now, before anything else, because it matters later. Everything that happened to my sister and the man I almost married happened because of what I do for a living, not because of anything I decided to do to them. I want that distinction to be clear from the start, because for a long time afterward, people in my family tried to tell a different story. They tried to make me the villain of what I'm about to tell you. I was not the villain. I was, for once in my life, simply the only person in the room who couldn't be lied to. I grew up the older of 2 daughters in a comfortable, unremarkable house outside a mid-sized city, with a father who sold industrial insurance and a mother who ran the front office of a pediatric dental practice. My sister Jessica is 4 years younger than me, and from the time she was old enough to understand that Arun could be won over, she won it over. She was the daughter who got cast as the lead in the school play, who came home with modeling scouts business cards from the mall, who could walk into any group of strangers and leave 20 minutes later with 3 new phone numbers and an invitation to something. I was not that daughter. I was the one who color-coded her class notes and got a partial academic scholarship and spent her summers doing unpaid internships instead of going to the lake house with friends. My parents loved us both, I believe that completely, but they loved us differently, the way you love a reliable car and a beautiful one. Nobody worries about the reliable car. Nobody throws a parade for it either. I don't say any of this looking for sympathy. I say it because it's the soil this whole story grew out of, and because I think a lot of you watching had a Jessica in your life too, a sibling, a coworker, a friend who never seemed to want what you had until the exact moment you got it. I met Ryan Carter at a compliance conference in Denver 4 years ago, in a hotel bar that smelled like burnt coffee and stale carpet cleaner, where he was giving a talk on small business lending risk for a regional credit union and I was there representing my firm's audit practice. He was funny in the specific way that finance people are rarely allowed to be funny, self-deprecating, quick, unbothered by his own mistakes when he talked about them. He asked for my badge instead of my number, which I found strangely charming at the time, and texted me a photo of it an hour later captioned, "Proof I wasn't imagining you." We dated long distance for a year before he moved to be near me. He got a job as a regional loan officer, then a branch manager, then a director of business development at a mid-sized commercial lender, each promotion a little faster than felt entirely explainable, though at the time I told myself he was simply good at his job the way I was good at mine. He proposed on the 2-year anniversary of the night we met, at the same hotel bar in Denver, down on one neon carpet that had, thankfully, been replaced. Looking back now, with the particular clarity that only comes after the truth has already ruined everything, there were cracks. Small ones. Ryan was always slightly evasive about the details of his commissions and bonuses, waving off my questions with a joke about how boring finance talk was, which struck me even then as strange, since finance talk was the entire foundation of our relationship. He took calls in other rooms. He had a company credit card he used more than seemed proportional to a director-level salary, and when I asked once, lightly, half-joking, whether his firm knew he was taking his team to steakhouses every other week, he laughed and told me I sounded like an auditor. I remember laughing too. I remember thinking, I am an auditor, and letting it go, because I loved him, and because loving someone and auditing someone are two very different postures to hold at the same time, and I didn't yet understand that I would eventually have to choose between them. Jessica liked Ryan from the first dinner I brought him to. She liked him the way she liked everything that was mine, with a warmth that took me years to correctly identify as covetousness rather than affection. She'd ask him questions about his work with a focus she never gave my other boyfriends. She'd show up to family dinners in outfits that seemed engineered for a different kind of evening than the one we were having. My mother used to say, "Isn't it nice they get along so well?" And I used to agree with her, because the alternative, that my sister was quietly building a case for a life that already belonged to me, wasn't something I let myself consider. I had spent 30 years training myself not to compete with Jessica. It never occurred to me I might need to. We got married on a Saturday in October, at a restored barn venue 40 minutes outside the city, string lights threaded through the rafters, 212 guests, a band Ryan and I had picked out together after 4 separate audition nights. I wore my mother's veil, remade by a seamstress in the historic district. I did my own makeup trial 3 times until I got it right. I am, by nature, a person who plans for contingencies, and I had planned for weather, for a missing groomsman, for a caterer running late. I had not planned for what actually happened, because it did not occur to me that the danger to my wedding day was sitting 6 feet away from me in a bridesmaid dress the color of dusty rose that I had personally chosen. The ceremony went perfectly. I want to say that clearly, because for months afterward, in my own memory, I let the ending erase the beginning, and it deserves to be remembered honestly. Ryan cried when I came down the aisle. My father walked me and didn't say a word the whole way, which for him was its own kind of speech. We said our vows, we exchanged rings, the officiant pronounced us married, and for perhaps 3 hours after that, I was the happiest I have ever been in my life. It happened during the toasts. Jessica was my maid of honor. She'd asked for the position herself, months earlier, over brunch, with an enthusiasm I mistook for love. She stood up with a champagne glass in one hand and a folded note card in the other, and she began the way maids of honor begin, with a story about us as kids, a joke about how I used to organize her toys by color when she wasn't looking. The room laughed. I laughed. And then she set the note card down on the table, which I noticed because it was such a small, deliberate motion, and she said she actually had a different announcement to make tonight, one she'd promised herself she'd stop being a coward about. She said she was in love with someone in the room, and that she wasn't going to spend one more day pretending otherwise out of politeness, and that she thought everyone deserved a wedding that started with the truth instead of ending with a lie sitting quietly at the head table. She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. Every head at that table turned toward Ryan at the exact same moment, the way a flock of birds turns without anyone giving a signal, and I watched my husband of 4 hours not look surprised. I watched him look caught. I'm not going to walk you through the next 20 minutes in detail, because some things don't need to be relived scene by scene to be understood, and because frankly, a lot of it I only reconstructed later from what guests told me. What I remember directly is this: Ryan stood up. He said my name. He did not deny it. My mother started crying in a way I later learned wasn't shock, because she had known for 6 weeks and told no one, hoping, she said afterward, that it would resolve itself before the wedding and I'd never have to find out. My father put his hand flat on the table like he was trying to keep it from tipping over. And I sat in my wedding dress, in a chair with my new husband's jacket still draped over the back of it, and I understood with total, icy clarity that I had built an entire day, an entire year, an entire relationship, on top of something that had already ended without my knowledge or my consent. I didn't scream. I want you to know that, because it's the part of the story people always seem most surprised by. I stood up, I took off the ring, I set it on the table next to Jessica's note card, and I walked out through the barn doors into the cold October air, and I did not stop walking until I reached my car. My best friend Megan drove me home. My wedding dress hung in my closet, tags never removed from the veil, for 11 months before I could bring myself to donate it. I want to be honest about the year that followed, because it wasn't cinematic and it wasn't fast. I did not immediately become the composed, unbothered woman I'm speaking to you as now. For about 6 weeks I barely functioned. I took leave from work, which my firm granted without a single question, because everyone there had heard some version of what happened, and grief that public has a way of arriving before you do. I saw a therapist twice a week instead of once. I deleted every photo of Ryan from my phone in one furious sitting at 2 in the morning and then spent the next 3 days regretting it, because grief doesn't respect your timeline, it just shows up whenever it wants and rearranges the furniture. My family fractured in the way families do after something like this, unevenly, with everyone choosing their own private version of blame to hold on to. My father stopped speaking to Jessica entirely for about 4 months, which surprised me, given how she'd always been the favored one. My mother tried, disastrously, to stay neutral, hosting a dinner about 6 weeks after the wedding where she invited both Jessica and me without telling either of us the other would be there, an ambush of reconciliation that ended with me leaving before the appetizers arrived and not speaking to my mother for the better part of a year afterward. Jessica, for her part, sent me one text message in the first 3 months. It said, "I know you probably hate me right now, but I hope one day you'll understand that sometimes you can't help who you fall for." I did not respond. I have still, to this day, never responded to that message, and I don't intend to. What surprised me most, in the wreckage of it, was how quickly Ryan and Jessica moved forward without me in the picture. Within 2 months they were living together in the apartment Ryan and I had been planning to move into as a married couple. The lease he and I had signed together quietly transferred to the two of them with a landlord who, I later learned, hadn't even been told the tenant situation had changed. Within 4 months there were engagement photos on Jessica's social media, taken at a lake house I recognized because I had been there myself, years earlier, on a family vacation. Within 7 months there was a save the date. I muted them both online within the first week and never unmuted. I heard everything secondhand, through my mother in the rare moments we spoke, through cousins who couldn't resist mentioning it, through the particular grapevine that exists in every extended family for exactly this kind of news. I built my life very deliberately around not knowing more than I had to. I threw myself into work in the way that people who are good at their jobs throw themselves into work when their personal lives have collapsed, which is to say, completely and a little bit dangerously. I took on cases nobody else wanted. I stayed late. I became, within that year, one of the most requested fraud examiners at my firm, not because I was chasing a promotion, but because the alternative to working was sitting alone in an apartment thinking about a barn full of string lights. I want to pause here and say, if any of you are in the early, ugly part of a betrayal like this, the part where you can't imagine ever feeling steady again, I see you, and I promise the ground does come back under your feet eventually, even when it feels impossible. It won't look like revenge. It will look like getting up and going to work on the days you don't want to. That's what it looked like for me, for almost a full year, before anything else happened at all. If this story is resonating with you so far, hit subscribe now, because what happened next isn't something I went looking for. It found me, at my own desk, on an ordinary Tuesday, and I didn't understand what I was looking at until it was far too late for the two people it belonged to. The wedding invitation arrived by mail 11 months after my own wedding fell apart, which felt like a cruelty so precise it had to be either deliberate or the universe's idea of a joke. Cream cardstock, gold foil lettering, a date in June at the same barn venue where I had said my own vows, because apparently in my mother's ongoing campaign for family unity, she had recommended the venue to Jessica herself, and Jessica, either out of spite or a genuine and staggering lack of self-awareness, had booked it. I did not open it for 3 days. It sat on my kitchen counter, propped against a bowl of unripe avocados, and every time I walked past it I felt something twist behind my sternum that I recognized, from therapy, as the specific flavor of anger that hasn't decided yet whether it wants to become grief instead. On the fourth day, my therapist, Dr. Morgan, asked me a question that I've thought about many times since. She asked whether I was angry that I'd been invited, or angry that some small part of me wanted to go. I didn't answer her right away. But I opened the envelope that night. Inside, alongside the invitation, was a handwritten card in my sister's looping, confident script. It said, "Natalie, I know this is a lot to ask, and I understand completely if the answer is no. But you're still my sister, and it wouldn't feel right not to at least offer you the chance to be there. No hard feelings either way. V. No hard feelings either way, as though what had happened between us was a scheduling conflict rather than the total dismantling of my life in front of 200 people. I sat with that card for a long time. I want to tell you I threw it away immediately, that I laughed it off, that I never gave it a second thought. That wouldn't be true, and I promised you the honest version of this story. Part of me, the exhausted, grief-worn part that had spent 11 months trying to prove to everyone including myself that I was fine, wanted to walk into that barn in a beautiful dress and let them see exactly how fine I actually was. I did not RSVP yes. I did not RSVP at all. I set the invitation in a drawer and went back to work, and I told myself the matter was closed. It was not closed. It was, in fact, the very beginning of the part of this story where the truth started finding its own way to the surface, whether anyone had invited it or not. About 5 weeks after the invitation arrived, my firm was retained by a regional bank's board of directors to conduct an independent forensic review of a commercial lending portfolio flagged by internal audit for unusual patterns, loans that had been approved unusually quickly, with unusually generous terms, to a cluster of small businesses that all seemed, on paper, to be legitimate. This is, for what it's worth, an extremely normal kind of engagement in my field. Banks bring us in dozens of times a year for exactly this reason, and in probably 4 out of 5 cases, the anomaly turns out to be nothing more than an overworked underwriting team cutting corners under deadline pressure, not fraud. I was assigned to the engagement along with 2 colleagues from my firm. Nobody involved in staffing that project knew, or had any reason to know, anything about my personal life, because I had never once mentioned Ryan's employer by name to anyone at work. I want to be completely clear about that, because I know how convenient it might sound, months later, that the case landed on my desk specifically. It didn't land on my desk because of who I was. I landed on the case because I was available and qualified, the same way I'd been staffed on 40 other engagements before it. It was on the 3rd day of document review, cross-referencing loan officer names against approval timestamps, that I saw it. Ryan Carter, Director of Business Development. 11 loans, all approved within 48 hours of application, all to companies with addresses that, when I looked closer, traced back to a small handful of shared registered agents, the kind of paperwork shortcut people use when they're setting up shell entities quickly and don't want the effort of doing it properly. My stomach did something complicated. I remember sitting very still at my desk for almost a full minute, the way you sit still after you've stepped on ice and felt it crack, waiting to see if it's going to hold. I did what I am trained to do, and what I would have done for any name on that list. I flagged it to my engagement lead and recused myself from any direct interviews involving Ryan, disclosing plainly that he was my former fiancé and that I had a personal conflict of interest that needed to be documented and managed. My firm handled it exactly the way firms are supposed to handle these things, reassigning the interview work to a colleague while I continued on the broader document analysis, where my findings would be independently verified rather than taken on faith. I want you to understand this clearly. I did not go looking for a way to hurt Ryan. The evidence was simply already there, sitting in a spreadsheet, waiting for someone competent enough to notice it. I happened to be that someone. What the full review eventually uncovered, over the following 6 weeks, was a kickback scheme. Ryan had been approving inflated commercial loans to a group of small businesses that were, functionally, fronts, some of them run by acquaintances. One of them, I later learned with a strange, hollow feeling, registered to an address I recognized as a rental property owned by Jessica's college roommate. In exchange for pushing the loans through without proper underwriting, Ryan had been receiving a percentage back in cash and, in at least 2 documented instances, in the form of vendor payments made directly toward his own upcoming wedding, a florist deposit, a portion of a catering invoice, funneled through one of the shell businesses and disguised in its books as a marketing expense. The wedding at the barn, the one I had received a cream-colored invitation to, was in part paid for with money extracted from a bank's loan portfolio through fraud. I did not celebrate when I understood the full shape of it. I remember, honestly, feeling sick. Whatever I had once loved about Ryan, whatever version of him I had built a life around, had apparently never stopped taking shortcuts, never stopped believing that other people's carelessness was his opportunity, and I had simply been the first person in his life patient enough, or naive enough, to overlook it for 4 years. I turned in my findings. I did my job. And then I did the only thing that felt like mine to do in the entire situation. I let the process work exactly the way it was designed to work, without a single additional word from me. The bank's internal counsel referred the findings to their regulator and to law enforcement roughly 3 weeks before Jessica and Ryan's wedding date, which meant that by the time the two of them stood at the front of that familiar barn, under those same string lights, Ryan already knew, or at minimum strongly suspected, that an investigation into his lending practices was underway. He did not know the full extent of what my firm had found. He almost certainly did not know that the woman who'd built the spreadsheet that started it all was the same woman he'd left standing in a wedding dress 11 months earlier. I know this because I never told anyone in my family, and I never contacted him directly, not once, at any point. I did not attend the wedding. I sent no RSVP, no gift, no card. I spent that Saturday, by pure coincidence of scheduling, on a work call with the bank's compliance officer, reviewing the final structure of our report before it went to the board, entirely unaware that at the exact hour I was on that call, my sister was walking down the same aisle I once had, in a dress that, according to my mother, who did attend and described it to me afterward in a tone I couldn't quite read, was almost identical in silhouette to my own. I learned the details the way I'd learned everything else that year, second-hand, through my mother, who called me the following week sounding strange, hesitant, the way she sounds when she's about to ask me something she already suspects she won't like the answer to. She told me the wedding had gone beautifully. She told me Ryan had seemed distracted during the reception, taking phone calls outside, checking his phone at the head table in a way she'd found odd but hadn't wanted to mention to anyone. She told me they'd left for their honeymoon 2 days later, a resort in the Maldives that Ryan had, according to Jessica's social media, been planning for over a year, overwater bungalow, private plunge pool, the kind of trip that costs more than most people's cars. I said very little on that phone call. What was there to say? I hung up, made myself a cup of tea, and went back to finishing the last section of a report that, unbeknownst to my mother, unbeknownst to Jessica, unbeknownst to almost everyone except a small circle of bank executives and 2 federal investigators, was about to change the rest of their lives. Here is the part of the story most of you have been waiting for, and I want to tell it exactly as it happened, without exaggeration, because the truth genuinely didn't need any help. My firm's final report went to the bank's board on a Monday. Under federal banking regulations, once a suspected fraud of that scale is confirmed by an independent forensic review, the bank has strict, non-negotiable obligations, filing a suspicious activity report with regulators, notifying law enforcement, and in most cases involving an employee still actively on payroll, immediately freezing that employee's access to any company accounts, cards, and systems tied to the fraud. None of that required my involvement. None of it was something I requested, suggested, or had any authority to influence one way or the other. I want to be completely clear on that point, because I know it would be a more satisfying story if I'd orchestrated the timing myself, and I didn't. I simply did my job accurately, and the institutions responsible for what happened next did theirs. What I didn't know, until my mother called me 11 days later in a state of complete disbelief, was that Ryan had used a company-linked corporate card, one tied to his director-level expense account, to cover a significant portion of the honeymoon, the resort deposit, several dinners, a private excursion, on the logic, I can only assume, that it would simply blend into his usual expense pattern and be reimbursed or absorbed the way it apparently always had been. The moment the fraud investigation triggered the account freeze, that card, along with every other account linked to his employment, stopped working entirely, mid-trip, on a remote island resort roughly 8,000 miles from home. My mother described the scene to me the way it had been described to her by Jessica, tearful and furious on the phone from the resort's business center, which was apparently the only place with reliable enough internet to make an international call. The front desk had informed them, politely but firmly, that the card on file for incidentals and the remaining balance of their stay had been declined. Ryan tried 2 personal cards next, both of which, it turned out, were also affected, one because it was a joint account he shared with his employer's payroll deposits that had been frozen as part of the same regulatory action, another because, as I would later learn, he'd been carrying significantly more personal debt than Jessica had ever known about. Debt he'd been managing for years through exactly the kind of shortcuts that had finally caught up with him. They were, according to my mother, 3 days from the end of their 2-week honeymoon when the resort manager sat them down and explained, as gently as a man in that position can, that unless a valid form of payment could be provided within 24 hours, the hotel would be forced to involve local authorities regarding the outstanding balance. A policy the resort apparently enforces strictly given how remote and expensive evacuation and dispute resolution become on an island like that. My mother, mortified and somehow still protective of her younger daughter even in that moment, wired them enough money to settle the bill and book emergency flights home, a fact that, when I learned it, told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly that particular family pattern had simply shifted one generation over, from me to her. They flew home 2 days early. Ryan was placed on administrative leave the moment he landed, pending the outcome of the federal investigation, and was formally terminated 6 weeks later. I'm not able to discuss, and frankly don't know, every detail of what followed for him legally, since that process continued well outside of anything I was involved in professionally once my firm's engagement concluded, but public court records, which anyone can look up, show that he was charged the following spring with bank fraud and wire fraud in connection with the loan scheme, and that as of the time I'm recording this, that case remains in the court system. I did not gloat. I want to say that plainly, because I know it would be easy to imagine me sitting somewhere with a glass of wine feeling victorious, and that isn't what it felt like at all. What it felt like, mostly, was strange. I had spent a year building a version of myself who had moved past all of it, and then the truth simply arrived on its own schedule. Entirely independent of my grief or my anger or my healing, and did what the truth generally does when you leave it alone long enough. It surfaced. If you've ever watched karma take its time and then arrive anyway, on a schedule that had absolutely nothing to do with your own patience, hit subscribe, because the way my family responded to all of this was almost as revealing as the fraud itself. Jessica called me 9 days after they landed back in the country. I hadn't spoken to her directly in almost a year, not since the message I never answered, and I remember staring at her name on my phone screen for 4 full rings before I picked up, mostly out of a curiosity I couldn't quite talk myself out of. She didn't open with an apology. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I certainly did. She opened by asking me, in a voice thick with the particular exhaustion of someone whose entire world has just come apart, whether I had known. Whether I'd had anything to do with it. Whether, and I remember this phrase exactly because it landed like a slap, I'd been sitting on this the whole time waiting for my moment. I told her the truth, calmly, the way I'd tell it to any client asking about the boundaries of an engagement I'd worked on. I told her I'd been staffed on an independent forensic audit for a bank, that I had disclosed my conflict of interest the moment I recognized Ryan's name, that I had not conducted a single interview involving him, and that the evidence against him existed entirely independently of anything I felt about either of them. I told her I understood if she didn't believe me, but that it happened to be true, and that unlike some people in this story, I didn't feel the need to dress the truth up in something prettier than what it actually was. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that I've turned over in my head many times since, because I think it was the most honest thing my sister has ever said to me. She said, "I always thought you were the boring one. The safe one. I never thought anything that happened to you would end up mattering to me." I told her I was sorry that her marriage was in trouble, and I meant it, in the specific, limited way you can mean something like that about a life you no longer have any stake in. I told her that I hoped, whatever came next for her, that she found a version of honesty that didn't require someone else's wedding to arrive at it. Then I told her I needed to go, and I hung up, and I sat on my kitchen floor for a while, not crying, just breathing, the way you breathe after you've set down something heavy you didn't realize you were still carrying. My mother tried, in the weeks that followed, to broker some version of peace between us again, the way she always has, the way I suspect she always will. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that I loved her, and that I was willing to keep having a relationship with her, but that I was done being asked to manage anyone's feelings about consequences I had nothing to do with creating. She didn't love hearing that. But she heard it, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't argue. It's been just over a year now since the honeymoon that ended early, and life on the other side of all of it looks quieter than I expected it to. Jessica and Ryan are, as far as I know through the narrow channel of family updates I still allow myself to receive, separated, living in different states, their finances still tangled in the slow, grinding machinery of a federal criminal case and whatever divorce proceedings will eventually follow it. I don't take pleasure in describing that to you. I simply think it matters to the shape of this story, because so many of you watching are probably wondering whether the people who hurt you ever really face what they did, and the honest answer, more often than people expect, is that eventually, in one form or another, they do. Not because someone else engineers it. Because the truth is patient, and it rarely forgets where it's owed. I met someone new about 8 months ago, a structural engineer named Andrew who has never once, in the entire time I've known him, made me feel like I needed to prove I was worth staying for. We're not engaged. I'm in no hurry this time. I've learned that the version of love that requires you to ignore your own instincts in order to keep it isn't really love at all, it's a kind of debt you keep paying without ever being told the interest rate. What I want to leave you with, more than the satisfaction of watching two people get exactly what their choices built for them, is this. I never once, at any point in this entire story, had to lie, manipulate, or manufacture anything in order for the truth to come out. I did my job honestly, the same way I always had, and honesty turned out to be the only weapon I ever needed. If you are sitting somewhere right now, nursing a betrayal that feels unfinished, that feels like the other person got away clean, I want you to hear me when I say that very few people actually get away clean. Most of them are simply still mid-flight, and you may not be there to watch when the ground finally comes up to meet them. But it usually does. I don't owe my sister a wedding invitation, and she never owed me one either, not really, not once she'd already decided what she wanted from mine. What I do believe, more now than I ever did before all of this happened, is that the quietest kind of justice is often the truest kind, the kind that doesn't need you to raise your voice, doesn't need you to plot or scheme or wait up at night rehearsing what you'll say. It just needs you to keep doing your job, keep telling the truth, and let everyone else's choices finally catch up to them on their own schedule. That's my story. A wedding toast that should have stayed a toast, a spreadsheet that told the truth nobody else would, and a honeymoon that ended 3 days early on an island 8,000 miles from home. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever watched karma take its sweet time and then arrive anyway, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done in my position. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe to Calm Stories Time, because there are a lot more stories like this one coming, and you won't want to miss the next one. I'll see you there.